This is part 2 of the Chapter 11A lectures. We're on slide number 22. We are starting here with, we covered the neuroglial cells of the peripheral nervous system. Now, two of those cells are, we covered the neuroglial cells of the central nervous system. And now we're going to cover two that are not found in the central nervous system, but they are found in the peripheral nervous system. And the good thing is they have functions very similar to two of the cells of the central nervous system. So instead of astrocytes, which form the blood-brain barrier and carry nutrients to the nerve cells while keeping out some of the bad things in the blood from reaching the nerve cells. Satellite cells are like those astrocytes. They're going to form a barrier that prevents your blood vessels, your blood, from coming in contact with the neurons within the PNS, the peripheral nervous system. So basically, satellite cells are found in the PNS and astrocytes are found in the CNS, and they both do basically the same job. Schwann cells are found in the PNS and do basically the same job as the oligodendrocytes in the CNS. So they form myelin sheaths around axons, which will make the electrical impulse travel faster down the axon. And this shows you the satellite cells and how they wrap around the cell body of this neuron, preventing any blood from contacting or any harmful substances from contacting that neuron. And then you see the myelination, which is formed by the Schwann cells. All right, neurons themselves, again, are nerve cells. Neuron is just another word for nerve cell. The body of the neuron is either called the perikaryon or the soma. I prefer soma, or just simply cell body. But it is also called the perikaryon. In the cell body, things that happen in other cells happen in neurons as well. But so like synthesizing proteins, membranes, chemicals. Nesal bodies are groups of rough ER that synthesize proteins, and the neurotransmitters are typically synthesized by the cell body of the neuron. So the neurotransmitters, like in the muscle chapter when we learned about acetylcholine, the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, well, that's where the nesal bodies come in, is they can produce a large amount of those types of chemicals. The cell body contains a nucleus with a nucleolus, typical to all cells, all human body cells. Some contain pigments. The plasma membrane is part of a receptive region that receives input from other neurons. So in other words, the axon of another neuron can send a signal to the cell body of this neuron. All right. Most neuron cell bodies are located in the central nervous system. When we say nuclei, which we're going to use, especially when we talk about the brain and the spinal cord, of course, central nervous system, there are going to be clusters of neuron cell bodies in the central nervous system. But when we use the term ganglia, they're going to be clusters of neuron cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. So clusters of neuron cell bodies are either called nuclei, which is a central nervous system term, or ganglia, which is a peripheral nervous system term. These are just definition terms. Tracts, these are different neuron processes that stick out from the neuron. A tract is a bundle of neuron processes in the central nervous system, probably bundles of axons many times. Nerves are bundles of neuron processes in the peripheral nervous system. So when we say, name a nerve, okay, so the renal nerve supplies the kidney because renal is for kidney. So the renal nerve is bundles of axons from the peripheral nervous system. It's not just one neuron, it's bundles of neuron processes in the peripheral nervous system. Now, processes consist of dendrites and axons. The dendrites receive signals, axons deliver signals or carry impulses. This particular neuron is a neuron called a multipolar neuron. So when that comes up later, you'll know. These are the neurons that we learned. The multipolar neurons were the ones that we were learning about in the muscle chapter and the skeletal. They tend to stimulate our skeletal muscle. Here is your cell body. That's the cell body. You can see the nucleus, and inside that you can see the nucleolus. You see all the dendrites, which are the areas of the neuron that receive impulses. The axon hillock is where an action potential begins. And I'll explain more about that to you later. The chromatophilic substance or Niesel bodies are your rough ER. Don't forget they're also called Niesel bodies because they are, and I don't know what's going to be used on your exam and your lab practical. All right, the axon is this whole thing that leads from the cell body, has branches, and it is going to generate an action potential or nerve impulse and conduct it all the way to a target, some target. And this is a peripheral neuron, and you can tell that why? Because it contains Schwann cells that form the myelin sheath. If it was a central nervous system neuron, then it would contain oligodendrocytes that formed the myelin sheaths. And the myelin sheath, remember, is there to increase the speed of the action potential or electrical impulse. All right, dendrites. Motor neurons can contain hundreds of dendrites. They contain the same organelles as in the cell body. That's something that you might not think that because they're so thin, but they are the receptive region of the neuron. They receive impulses. They receive electrical information, and they convey that information toward the cell body as graded potentials. We're going to learn about resting potentials, graded potentials, and action potentials. The action potential or nerve impulse that takes a signal to a target, that is called an action potential. That's what it goes only, you only have that kind of potential in an axon. The cell body and the dendrites have graded potentials. In other words, they are different strengths. They're short distance signals. They have to add up to a certain strength before they can trigger the axon to have an action potential. Okay. And this is just electron micrograph photograph of a neuron cell body or a dendritic spine and a neuron cell body. You see how small it is. They've got this thing labeled wrong. I was looking at it going, what? Maybe you were too. They have got this thing labeled wrong. So, what is this part? This part is the neuron cell body. And then all of these extensions, I'll just use a different color, make sure it's clear. We'll use purple. All of these extensions along here are dendrites, dendritic spines, dendrites. Dendrite is fine. Okay, sorry about that. The axon of the neuron begins with the axon hillock. That's the part that contacts the cell body. So this is where the axon begins. Some axons can be over 1 meter long. Those of you with long legs, I don't fall in that category, but my daughter does. But if you have long legs, your sciatic nerve or your femoral nerve would be the longest of the leg nerves, and they can be over 1 meter long depending on how tall you are. So axons can be very, very long structures. These are some of the largest cells in the body, these neurons. Long axons, really long axons, are called nerve fibers, and they combine to make together, they bundle together to make up a nerve, like the renal nerve, or I just named the sciatic nerve, the femoral nerve, which are located beginning in your hip down to your ankle area. All right, sometimes axons have branches called axon collaterals. And then axons always branch at the end, and the branches at the ends are called terminal branches. And the ends themselves are called axon terminals. So we've got the axon hillock, and then the entire length of the axon, and at the end we have the axon terminals. The axon terminals release the neurotransmitters. We learned this. This is not new information. We learned this in chapter 10. So the region that secretes neurotransmitters is the axon terminal. Those neurotransmitters can be acetylcholine that stimulates the contraction of our skeletal muscles, or there are many other neurotransmitters that we will learn about. Okay, movement in axons occurs in both directions, but we tend to teach about the movement that goes away from the cell body. So when we say anterograde, we're talking about away from the cell body. And retrograde is movement toward the cell body. And what we're talking about here are the organelles within the axons. Okay, so if the organelles within the axons are moving away from the cell body further down the axon, it's called anterograde, that movement. And when those organelles are moving toward the cell body within the axon, then we call that retrograde movement. Why would viruses and bacterial toxins, if they're allowed to contact the neuron, why would they be coming back toward the cell body? Well, because the cell body contains lysosomes that can digest them. The cell body can present the viruses and the bacterial toxins to your immune system, so your immune system will recognize and destroy them. Okay, certain viruses and bacterial toxins damage neurotissues by using retrograde axonal transport, carrying the virus or bacteria from the end of the axon back toward the cell body. These diseases are examples of that: polio, rabies, herpes simplex viruses, and tetanus. And we'll stop here. We'll begin with myelination in the peripheral nervous system.